play the drums. I'm actually not that good at it, but I'm good enough to just come out here and jam and to have fun. But I remember when I was learning to play in high school, I had a drum teacher, and he wanted to do things like this. And it's like, that's not fun. That's not how, when I see people jamming and going crazy on the drums, they're not doing. But this is the fundamentals I needed to learn before I could then go. Right? And you start building and building, and then pretty soon you can come out here and jam for an hour, work up a sweat, and just have a really good time. So, why do I tell you this? Engineers are planners. They're problem solvers. They can make really complex things by just breaking it down to the basics and being able to attack those basics just one at a time. In the same way that climbing a really tall mountain seems like an amazing accomplishment, but if you break it down, it's just one step in front of the other, right? Eventually, if you do that enough times, you're on top of Mount Everest. So the more you can take something complex and then break it down to its basics and then attack those basic elements, you'll be able to make stuff that's 10 times cooler, and it will be 10 times easier. So the research phase of the engineering and design process of brainstorm, research, prototype, final build, I really like this one. This is where you really learn to think and act like an engineer. And so you might be excited, like, look, I just want to build something. I totally get it. So do I. But don't skimp on this phase. We're going to start simple so we can get it into our muscle memory of the right way to attack this. But if you can get this down, the stuff that you can make is basically the sky's the limit. If you follow these simple principles we'll talk about during the research phase, the complexity, the amazingness, the effectiveness, the awesomeness of anything you make will increase tenfold. So this step is super, super important. And so with that, let's head to the shop. All right, we're back at the shop, and now we're with Big Robots Pop Footballs. We're on robots, right? This one is the research phase. So this will be 2 videos. The first one, we're just going to open up the design space. The next video, that's research part 2, will kind of then be like condensing down our research to like generally the areas that we want to take to the next phase, which is pop, which is prototype, right? The prototype phase. So the big part of the research phase is I generally know what I want the Snackapult to do, but I want to kind of break it down into bite-sized chunks, some way to wrap my head around that. And the way we do that is what we call requirements. Another word for requirements are like constraints. You might hear the word constraint, you'd be like, oh, constraints, that would hold you back. But you actually want constraints. Otherwise, it's like you have an infinite amount of possibilities, and it's really hard to suffer from analysis paralysis. You really want to select something and move in a specific direction. So these constraints and requirements help you map out what's most important and what's less important, and really focus your energies where it matters the most. So for the sake of the Snackapult, right, an example of constraints/requirements would be, it needs a mechanism to fire a piece of candy. And notice I'm not specifying what type of mechanism yet. Just the high level constraint is it needs some way to fire a piece of candy. It needs to fire at about 5 feet, right? Because if I'm using it in my shop, that's about the distance. I don't want it to fire at 1 foot. That's not enough. If it fired at 70 feet, that technically could work, but it could also chip my tooth. So I don't want that. Needs to fire at about 5 feet, right? So by coming up, and I'll do a bunch more in a second, specifically for the Snackapult. We'll do all of them just real time. But by coming up with these constraints and requirement, it just creates structure. It creates a way for your brain to attack the problem. And this is, by the way, exactly how they do it at NASA and Apple. I never did a project or a build there where the step 1 was to establish requirements. So for example, for getting the freaking rover to Mars, the scientists will be like, we have these 10 instruments and they need to get to Mars, but they need to work from negative 135 Celsius to plus 70 Celsius. They need to be able to withstand a vibration of this much, right? Because on the launch pad, it shakes that much. So that allows me as an engineer to then take those, I build my little widget, and I just have to, as long as I can meet those requirements, I know I'm good. I need some way to say that's good enough. and that will satisfy the requirements, and it's going to be safe. A question I get asked sometimes is like, what's the build you would do if you had unlimited money? It's like, I wouldn't want that. Like, that would be actually more difficult because these constraints can like breed creativity. So an example is I made the world's largest Jell-O pool, and as you know, you need to get Jell-O in the refrigerator overnight so it can like solidify, right? Well, how do you do that with a massive pool? Well, I could have gone to like an ice rink or used all these pipes and had these really complex solutions, but with a very limited amount of money, I was like, well, maybe I can take it to a certain location where it gets warm enough to have a pool party in the day, but cold enough that at night that it's basically a refrigerator. So I looked at a weather almanac and basically found a spot in Utah where my brother lives where we made that a part of the story. It's a little bit of a nugget of like, this is how we solved this complex thing. Plus, we're in this like amazingly beautiful setting, way more than if I had limited money as I just did it like in an ice rink. Another example is when I did digital duds. When I had the idea of two iPads, iPad in back, iPad in front, FaceTime chat looks like you have a hole in your body. People were like, cool idea, bro, but I don't have $1,200 for a Halloween costume. One commenter was like, yeah, I've got a cool idea for a Halloween costume too. All I need is 2 Aston Martins, a titanium donkey, and a metric ton of rabbit fur. Basically, like, yeah, bro, like, that's a really extreme costume. No one has those resources. So it made me go back to the table, like, how can I simplify this idea? And that's when I came up with, like, what if I had an app that played a video? I paired that with a shirt. If you duct tape them together, you have this really cool, like, living, breathing, animated costume for the price of a t-shirt and a free app. Those constraints helped me come up with a very creative, simple, elegant solution. And constraints can also be sort of like non-functional. So an example of the world's largest super soaker, one of my constraints or requirements was that it needs to look exactly like the smaller version. Now, the fact that I made it look like the smaller version functionally didn't have any effect on how far it fired or how many watermelons we could slice through. But that was an important part of the build that I didn't want to compromise on. That was part of the story. So that was one of my main requirements. Okay, well, let's do it. Let's talk more rock, Mark. So here we go. That's the beauty of this class, is that I'm not just telling you guys hand-waving how this stuff works. We're doing it real time. So these will be my requirements. And so now I'm just going to list some requirements. Needs to launch the candy. So notice I'm not saying exactly like how it needs to do that. Just the requirement is that it needs to launch a piece of candy. Now you might be thinking like, oh, well, this is obvious, but just go with me on this. You'll see why it matters. Another requirement is it needs some kind of trigger, right? So it knows when to fire. So like, in other words, like fire needs to be able to be fired on demand. So already, maybe you were thinking of a Snack-a-Pult, maybe you hadn't even thought of this, but by going through the requirements, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. That needs to be part of how I'm designing this thing, right? It would be cool if it could, instead of, it could fire a piece of candy and fire more, as opposed to like, it just fires one and then I have to go reload it. All right, so it needs to fire multiple without needing to reload. Let's say accurate 50% of the time. If I said it had to be 100% accurate, that makes the build like a lot more complicated. It's super precise, so it's like, I get to choose the takes I use, so that helps a lot. It would be cool to launch different kinds of candy, so I could have different flavors. So it would be cool, depending on my mood, might want Reese's Pieces, or I might want a Whopper, right? I could choose which candy I wanted. Oh, one I forgot, that was kind of a fundamental requirement we talked about earlier, needs to launch about 5 feet. It would be cool to have a like semi-automatic or automatic mode, right? So it's like, boom, it just like, I really need a power up. I can just do like 7 in my mouth all at once. So semi-automatic or burst fire mode. Again, I'm just thinking big here. It would be cool to maybe, it could like track me or it could aim. So track or aim. And some of these already, I'm going to be honest, like I know like that's probably out of the scope, but it's good to just kind of have like pie in the sky. How dope would it be if it could do these? We'll get to like ranking them in a second. Okay, so this is probably good for now. Now the next step actually comes from an experience I had that I learned painfully with the automatic bullseye dartboard. And that was my longest video so far it took me to make, because for the first 2 years, we tried to use our own motion tracking system. That was one of my own requirements. I wanted to build our own cameras that could track the dart and then figure out where it was three-dimensionally. Turns out that's an insanely complicated task. So I eventually went back to my list of requirements and I was like, look, do we really need to do that? Does the end user who watched this video, are they going to think it's less cool if we use like an off-the-shelf motion capture system? And when I was like, you know what, that's probably not a solid requirement. That's like a non-essential requirement. And once I was able to free that up, it allowed us to like get past that roadblock and make the really cool automatic bullseye dartboard. And no one really cared, right? That I didn't make that camera system myself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take this list of requirements. I'm going to break them up to essential and non-essential. And then within that, we're going to rank them. That's going to really help us like wrap our brain around like where we should focus our energies to make this a successful build. So instead of this, I'm not going to say just requirements. I'm going to say essential requirements, and these will be essential requirements and non-essential requirements. All right, so let me go through these now, and we'll look. Needs to launch the candy. That's about as essential as they get. Like some kind of mechanism launches the candy. It's hard to cut the corner on that. Choose from different kinds of candy. I think we could make a cool snackable that wasn't technically the ability. I think most of the bang for the buck, and that's how you should be thinking about this, like where do you get the most bang for the buck, comes from the idea that it launches a candy on demand, right? So therefore, needs a trigger, that's the fire on demand. It wouldn't work if it just like randomly hit me in the face, right? So that feels pretty critical to me. Needs to launch about 5 feet. That's critical because I'm doing it in my, like where I actually film, and that's exactly 5 feet. So that matters a lot. Needs to fire multiple without reloading. It's way cooler if I don't have to reload, but honestly, that's the magic of doing something on video is like, I could reload it in between shots. I could tell you guys I'm doing that, but it's not that big of a deal. If that saves me 7 days of work, like that's a great place to cut corners. It would still look cool if I could do it, even if I had to stop the camera and reload it in between shots. Accurate 50% of the time, that's kind of on the borderline. Track and aim, that feels less essential because I could lock it into a spot and just make sure I'm standing on a spot on the floor, right? So I'm kind of solving that one with a really simple solution, which is basically standing in the right spot. And then semi-automatic or burst fire, again, that kind of feels like a bonus. So now I've got 2 columns here. I just want to make sure now within these columns that I've kind of ranked them per priority. So needs to launch candy, fundamentally that's number 1. Needs a trigger, I would say that is number 2. This actually feels like it's in order. Launch about 5 feet and be reasonably accurate. Non-essential, I would say track and aim is the least non-essential. Needs to fire multiple without reloading is maybe, I kind of like the idea of different kinds of candy more than if I had to choose between one of these. The idea of being able to fire different types of candy I think is a little bit more interesting than the idea of like being able to fire multiple without reloading. So here we go. Now I've got a list of requirements. This is just like at freaking NASA, except instead of putting robots on other planets, we're building snackapults to make sure I'm well fed when I'm shooting a video. Same concept though. Got our essential requirements. Now this is going to help me focus the remainder of my research phase on the right spots, right? And you might say like, well, why even have the non-essential requirements? And those are good because it's like, I might find something in the research phase that makes one of these easier. You gotta just always be thinking bang for the buck, right? Everything is a trade-off. So I technically could totally make something that could do these, but it's like, is it law of diminishing returns where, this one specifically would take me, an extra 20 hours on the project, even though this took 4 hours, and it's like, it's not that much cooler, right? So I'm constantly making those decisions where it's like, this is good enough for what I need. There's no point in trying to get it 100% perfect. I might as well spend that time making 3 more robots that are all kind of cool than trying to make one that's like ultimate, works every time, does all of these things, right? Okay, now it's on to the exploration phase. We have our requirements. Now this is going to help us systematically kind of explore the full kind of spectrum of solutions. And the way to think about this is to think of like all the solutions as this 3D space. And your goal is to find the tallest possible mountain, right? What happens a lot is people will be like, oh, in their head, they know what they want to build. They just go straight and build it. And that might land them here. And with a little bit of tweaking, they might get here. And that's almost the worst possible outcome. Because with more research and prototyping, they might have been able to get it to this mountain. But if they really would have done good research and tried something here and here and here and here all over this map, maybe one right here, they would realize like, oh, this one seems the most promising. Look, there's a little mountain I can go up. And then they end up with this solution. And now they have some confidence that they have the best solution in the full space, right? But the only way you gain that confidence is going through Big Robots Pop Footballs, right? Build, research, prototype, final build. That's part of what we're doing here. Is the research phase is we're kind of like putting ourselves on all these different spots on this map, and we're seeing like, hey, which one of these looks the most promising? So don't fall into the trap of thinking like, I want to build a Snackapult, and like secretly I know I want to use springs. Think about what are all the different ways you can launch that candy. We'll do that in a second. The importance of doing it now is it's cheap to do it, right? If you were to do this later when you're actually making things, it's a lot more expensive to try different things. Now, if you're just researching and Googling and thinking, you can go through a lot of different options and get rid of stuff that won't work really quickly. You can explore a lot of these things without having to invest a lot of time. An example of this is on the Squirrel Ninja Warrior course, where you saw the final 8 things we used for the squirrels to go through, but in reality, that list was like 30 long, right? We thought of all different things we could make the squirrels go through, and then we were able to down select and pick the very best ones that were going to have the most bang for the buck. And that's the beauty of this, is it allows you to find like the global maxima, the best possible solution. Now, the next step is to take these requirements and sort of bit by bit, sort of put some meat on the bones and sort of come up with what will be the elements of our build, right? And the way to do this is we'll just go in order of priority. We'll just see each requirement one at a time and research what those could consist of, right? So I'll give a general overview of the steps first, and then once again, because we just do this, we'll actually power through it and do it together. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're kind of going to do a 4-step process to build out each of these requirements. Really explore the design space, right? So the first step is just really to go one requirement at a time, right? So we're going to start with one and we're going to build it out. Step 2 is, look at any background information regarding that specific requirement. So for example, for the squirrel video, I knew I wanted to launch a squirrel as one of the components, right? The penultimate challenge was they would get distracted, it would launch them over the bird feeder, and they'd have to go start again. But a question I had is like, how many G's can a squirrel withstand and still live, right? How much force could I impart on them and they'll still be okay? And as part of that, I found out that like squirrels actually can land at terminal velocity, which means they can survive a fall from any height. I was like, well, that's a juicy nugget. That's really cool. Not only does that help me with my build, but that's like something I probably want to include as part of the story, right? I learned how they do that. They make a parachute. They put their tail out. They put their arms out. So like this gave me things. Ooh, when I actually do this and I film this, I want to look out for that. Make sure I get footage of them doing that, because that's really interesting to tell people. For the case of our candy launcher, It's like, what is the average human reaction time? That's good information that exists, like scientific information that can help me with my build, because it helps me determine like at what velocity would I launch the candy, right? The third step is actually brainstorming different ways to accomplish this requirement. So in the case of launching the squirrel, I could use a pneumatic piston, I could use a spring, I could use an airbag. I'm going through like, what are all the different ways I can do that? And you're like, well, how do you do that? Well, there's a couple options. One, use your own brain. Maybe, this is where surfing the web comes in play. I remember seeing something on Reddit 2 years ago. There's this video. Let me look that up, right? Which leads to the second thing, which is like online, using Google. I'll search for patents. The way I figured out how to do the liquid sand hot tub was looking at like patents, because I knew in silos for my brain, I was like, I think they use liquefaction in silos to keep the grain going down. Well, how do they do it there? So I literally looked up patents and saw, they have a bunch of pipes with small holes in it, right? And that helped me figure out a direction to take, which is another good trick. Like, think of parallels. Whatever you're doing, is there something like this that already exists that I could steal from? So maybe for my candy launcher, I know people who build ping pong ball launchers. Maybe I can look at how they did that, because a piece of candy is about the same size, and there might be some parallels, something I could steal over and mold for my own design. Again, nothing is original. Everything is derivative. So take other things and kind of synthesize. That's where the magic happens. Another good trick, again, with online research is Google Images. I find that's really helpful because our brains process images really quickly. So you can Google it, go to images, and just scroll through. That catches your eye. Click on that, and then it takes you to the website where it gives you more info. The one thing I would caution you on is actually looking on YouTube, if you're making a YouTube video, for people who've done this exact thing. Sometimes I'll do a real quick search and squint and just make sure there isn't some massively popular video. But other than that, I really try and wait until where I'm really close to being done, because going back to this, if you watch someone else's video, you see, this is what they did, and they made it to this hill. And that's all you can have in your brain is like, the only hill I can climb is this. Whereas if you really try and on your own, what you'll realize is like, you will come up with something that's going to be even better than that. But because you didn't watch theirs first, you started here and you got up a much higher hill. And then the last resource for kind of like coming up with different options is talk to friends and family. That can be helpful even if they're not engineers or know how to build or make stuff. Tell them the topic of the video. If I said, hey, I'm making squirrels keep stealing my birdseed, I'm going to make a Ninja Warrior obstacle course for them, so they have to earn that birdseed. Everyone I told that to is like, that's really cool, right? So that gave me a sense. Maybe they're like, in fact, one friend who is an engineer, she's like, you should name the squirrels. I was like, that's a really good idea. Naming them really helped personifying. So they helped me shape the video. Another friend, I told her, yeah, check this out. One of these squirrels has nipples. And she's like, I think if they have nipples, that means they're pregnant. And I'm like, really? And so that led me to Google it. And sure enough, she was right. And so that led to this great narrative of Fantastic Gus versus Fat Gus, right? So it's like having conversations with people can be really helpful, even if they're not engineers. But if they are engineers, there's no shame in asking for advice either. Like, I always need to ask someone smarter than me on pretty much all of my builds. Like, that's a better way to do it. I get to learn more, it stretches me, and they're super excited to offer their input as well. So I really believe this phase should be collaborative, and honestly, it makes it more fun when you do it that way anyways. And then the last thing to keep in mind in this phase is keep an open list of science projects, is what I'll call them. So this is like questions that can't be answered with Google, where you'll just need to do a little experiment on your own. So again, going back to the squirrels, I Googled what squirrels like to eat, but I kind of don't care what the average squirrel likes to eat. I care about the squirrels in my backyard. I care about Fat Gus and Frank and Rick and Marty, right? So I put out 7 different options for them, and sure enough, they loved walnuts, right? It's a simple little experiment that helps my video, because I know I'm going to motivate them to the maximum amount. I've done that test, but it also lets the viewer know, like, dude, this guy's really invested. He's really covering all the bases. So they have confidence that my solution is the best one, because I'm doing it all. Another example is with the Jell-O pool, like at what temperature does it freeze? How cold is too cold? How much gelatin is needed? We tested all of these things to help us, again, with the prototype and final build. elephant toothpaste. There again, we tested so many options so that then when we scaled up and did the final one, we had a better understanding of what we'd get. So while you're in this phase, you should be keeping a list of like, okay, I need to do that. I need to do that experiment later, right? One last example is like if you're doing something, a machine that helps you not cry when you're cutting onions. Well, how cold does the onion need to get? I've heard that putting it in the fridge helps. I've heard that sharp knives help. So, try a dull knife, a sharp knife, a medium knife, seeing if any of these things matter as part of a test, right? Little science experiments. So as you're going through this, sort of keeping track of those as well. But the beauty of this phase is not only are you building out like all the possible ways to accomplish your thing, you're also just like coming up with the story and just keeping your eyes peeled for any juicy nuggets that can make the story that much more interesting.